Hello everyone, I'm here with the amazing Annie Murphy-Paul. Annie Murphy-Paul is an American acclaimed science writer whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Scientific American, and the Best American Science Writing, among many other publications. She's the author of Origins, The Cult of Personality, and now the book that we're going to discuss today, The Extended Mind. Annie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, you're welcome, Alex. Thank you for inviting me on.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we were mentioning, your book, The Extended Mind, has been regarded as a real treasure by many people, including myself, because it opens the door into a new perspective into how the mind really works and what the mind really is. So tell me, Annie, why do you think The Extended Mind is such an amazing read?
Well, I hope that readers find it to be that, Alex. I have gotten some very enthusiastic feedback about the book. And one thing that I've heard again and again from readers is that they felt seen by the book, they felt affirmed and validated by the book, because many of the techniques and the approaches to their thinking and their work that they had found their way to on their own, say, for example, incorporating movement into their thinking, or arranging the spaces in which they do their thinking, or deliberately finding ways to think with other people and not just alone. Those things are techniques that people have found very useful for themselves in their own lives, but it wasn't until they read The Extended Mind that they saw that there's actually quite a lot of scientific evidence in support of those techniques. So I hope that The Extended Mind offers something new and something original and something people haven't thought about before in terms of a framework for thinking about how our own minds operate. But I think there's also an element in which people who read the book find something familiar there too, something that they already knew, but reading it in a book of popular science really affirmed and validated them. And that makes sense because what's really unnatural is separating the mind from the body and from physical space and from interaction with other people. That is a very unnatural way to live, but it's the way that we've been taught to do our thinking. And so I think people sometimes have felt like a little embarrassed or furtive about what works for them. And here I am in the book saying, no, this is our nature as human beings. This is how we're meant to think. This is how we evolved to think. And here's the science showing that that's the case. So I think that's one reason people have responded.
Yes, and for me, you hit it like perfectly. It's just it shouldn't be, and this is not to give disrespect to you or your book, but it shouldn't be a mind blow that our mind has evolved, right? And
Right.
it seems that our you know routine and daily lives and corporate games that we play haven't priced in our evolutionary code, and you perfectly put it out in The Extended Mind that truly, what we call hacks is truly what we're built for. So it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of
Mm-hmm.
paradoxical to think in that way, right? But
Mm-hmm.
what I love about your book is that you truly dive deep into the role of intuition and what
Mm-hmm.
intuition really is.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
how are you able to explain such a difficult area to articulate
Mm-hmm.
what intuition is in our lives, and how should we understand the role intuition has on our decision making process?
One way that we colloquially describe intuition is as a gut feeling, and that really captures something very accurate about how intuition works. And although intuition can seem like this mysterious or almost magical quality, what I loved finding out from the research that I did for The Extended Mind is that it's actually very much based in the body and based in our everyday experience. There's nothing magical or in a way mysterious about it once you understand how it works. And how it works is that as we go through our daily lives, we're taking in so much information from our environment, far more than we could ever process or store on a conscious level. It would just be too much for our conscious minds to handle. But we are processing it and storing it on a non-conscious level for our later use. And then the question is, well, if it's stored on this non-conscious level, how do we access it? And the answer is it's the body that alerts us to, say, a pattern of experience that we've encountered before, that we're now seeing something like that happening again in our environment. And the body is constantly giving us little signals, like little taps on the shoulder or a little tug on the sleeve saying, pay attention. You've encountered a situation like this before. The body is preparing us to meet that new situation. And it's unfortunate that we are often encouraged to suppress these signals and cues from the body. We think that to think well and to get work done, we have to quash that and push it aside, when really we should be tuning in to those internal signals, which have so much information to offer us.
Yes, that's amazing. Thank you for that. And you right now, when you mentioned the cues that the body has and that we just feel like it's nothing, you mentioned in your book, The Extended Mind, the experiment researcher Demasio did with the cards. So it was for our listeners who haven't read The Extended Mind. I hope this is like a trigger for them to buy it now. So briefly, the experiment was they placed 4 cards, and they were kind of, I don't know if I prefer you explain it, because you're
Sure.
the
Yes.
expert. I'm like,
It's a very striking experiment. It was led by, as you say, Antonio Demasio, the neuroscientist at University of Southern California. And he presented participants in the study with 4 decks of cards, and told them to play basically a gambling game, which was try to maximize your wins and minimize your losses by choosing cards from these decks. And so the participants started doing that. They don't know anything about these decks. They don't know that the experimenters have set it up such that 2 decks are good, meaning they have lots of rewards in them, and 2 decks are bad. They have lots of penalties. And one other aspect of this is that as the participants are playing this game, it's a game on a screen, a digital game, they're also hooked up to a sensor that is measuring the activity of their nervous system. And what the experimenters found was that very quickly, the bodies of the participants caught on to the fact that there were 2 decks that were rewarding and 2 decks that were sort of dangerous because they had all these penalties. And so whenever the participants would start to think about or hover over a deck that was bad, their nervous system would you could see in the experimenters' data, it would register a kind of jolt, because the bodies of the participants were already sensing that there was danger, there was a threat there.
wow.
But what's so interesting is that on a conscious level, it took many, many more turns of revealing, turning over the cards and revealing what they showed, for people to catch on, the participants to catch on to consciously, to say, oh, I think I should be choosing more cards from these decks and not from these other decks, because now I see the pattern. But in fact, their bodies had figured that out long before. So that lets us know that, the conscious mind, as much as we identify ourselves with what we're aware of, the contents of our minds that we're actually aware of, that's just a tiny part of what's going on in our minds and bodies. Actually, there's a lot more that goes on that we're not aware of, but we can tune into it if we are in touch with those subtle cues from our bodies.
Amazing. And Annie, I have to put you on the spot now. Now that you have all of these amazing insights into what intuition is, and all of these experiments and research just proving how our body really is, takes less credit than it should in terms of being smart and having these cues, how have you used this knowledge that you have to have a more educated, quote unquote, intuitive gut feeling?
Yes. I will say that I have put to use a lot of what I learned in researching this book. And I would say that before I started working on this book, I was a very much what I call in the book a brain-bound person, meaning I really did kind of assume that thinking happens in the head. And if you want to do good thinking, that means sitting still, concentrating, working the brain. That was very much my mode. And since I did the research on this capacity called interoception, which is the ability to tune into our internal signals. I make much more of an effort to do that on a kind of regular basis throughout the day. And I don't mean a formal kind of mindfulness or meditation practice. I mean more of like okay, take a moment, pay attention to what's going on inside. What are those cues telling me? What can I learn from not just all this external stimuli that's flowing in all the time, but what can I learn from tuning in to the inside? And it's that kind of oscillation between all the information and stimuli that are on the outside and the more subtle and quiet signals that you really have to make an effort to pay attention to on the inside. It's that oscillation and movement back and forth between those two worlds that I have found to be really useful in my daily life.
Yeah, that's amazing. And one of the biggest insights from the extended mind and from your work has been the environment, how the environment plays a role into how we think and what the mind really is.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me, how does the mind shape? How the mind shapes itself in terms of how much the environment changes? Is this a
Mm-hmm.
fluctuation that happens
Mm-hmm.
constantly? And how
Mm-hmm.
can we leverage the power of this relationship for our daily lives?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Alex, because you know, the conventional way we tend to think about the brain is as a computer, and that metaphor leads us in a lot of directions that are less than ideal because the brain is really quite different from a computer. And one of the most glaring differences between a computer and a brain is that a computer works the same way no matter where it's located. It's not affected by its setting or its surrounding. But the human brain is exquisitely sensitive to context, to where it's doing its thinking. And so that means that it really matters for the quality of our thinking where we are, whether we feel safe and comfortable in that environment, whether we feel like we have a sense of ownership and control over our environment, whether we see things in our environment that affirm our identity, particularly our identity, the identity that corresponds to what we're doing at that moment, our identity as a student or as a worker, and whether we see things around us that make us lead us to have a sense of belonging, that we're part of a valued group. And so once we start thinking about our environment that way, we can start making informed choices about how to structure and arrange our environment so that it supports really optimal thinking, instead of imagining that we can do our thinking the same way wherever we are in whatever setting we find ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, I when I read The Extended Mind, it was just breathtaking for me because I've been working through in front of a computer like pretty
Mm-hmm.
much ever since I have a computer,
Mm-hmm.
and without taking into account the
Mm-hmm.
power of going for a walk for a
Mm-hmm.
brief period of time, watching nature, interacting with nature, uh, extending my mind through others people's minds. So it was
Mm-hmm.
really an eye opener, and I'd like to dive deep into how our social circles do have an impact in our mind, and it seems that today we interact with one another digitally as we're doing now,
Mm-hmm.
but also through our social media. And do you
Mm-hmm.
think this is a good replacement to the real,
Mm-hmm.
face to
Mm-hmm.
face interactions our minds need?
Yeah, certainly the platforms like this one we're using right now, Zoom, or all the other ways that we communicate and connect with each other digitally, have been are really convenient, and they've been a real lifesaver during the pandemic. But it's my view, based on the research, that this kind of digital interaction can't ever really replace or replicate the richness of the signals that we send and receive from each other when we're in person. And
Yeah.
so I think there's still a very big place in our learning and working lives for in-person interaction. I do want to note, though, that it's also the case that many group settings, like the open office, for example, that which a lot of people worked in before the pandemic, were really terrible places to do cognitive work, and they kind of were the worst of both worlds because people were distracted by all that was going on around them, and the brain really needs help in um, uh, sort of protecting its ability to focus, because we're such social creatures, we are so attuned to our environment, as we've been saying, and so it's very easy to get distracted in those busy environments. At the same time, the kinds of intense interactions that really enrich our thinking weren't really going on in those open offices either. In fact, research has shown that many times when people move from private offices to an open office setting, interaction among colleagues actually goes down, because in order to get their work done, people put on their headphones and retreat into their own worlds and kind of try to shut people out. So it's actually a kind of movement back and forth between having protected, isolated time when we're protecting ourselves from those distractions, combined with other times when we're very deliberately and intentionally interacting with one another in the social way that can really enrich our thinking. And so I think the challenge for us now is to think about, how do we create spaces that support that kind of movement from isolated time for deep work on our own and that kind of really intensely social and cooperative and collaborative kinds of interactions.
Yeah, that's amazing. And we used to think that, open space workplaces were the hit of these
Yeah.
past years. But in fact, as you say, the mind needs to digest how much
Mm-hmm.
stimulation is happening around us.
Mm-hmm.
And you touched on distractions, Annie, right now, what you're
Mm-hmm.
mentioning.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that our world is a place where, to really get focused, we really need to tune out distractions, because we're so overstimulated
Mm-hmm.
in pretty much every single aspect of the world, in terms of social media, in terms of anything. So, what have you seen with this impact of
Mm-hmm.
this overstimulation in the way our mind works? And is there a way to just go through it?
Yeah, I think one barrier we face to doing the right thing by our brains in terms of giving them the protected space that they need to do deep work, and this is something that Cal Newport, if you've read his work, really gets into very well. It's hard for us to recognize how much we're impaired by these constant distractions. We feel like we're successfully multitasking. We feel like we're working on something and, oh, but I'll just check my email for a moment, and it feels like, and then we go back to our work and we think everything's fine. But in fact, that little moment of distraction of looking at our email or looking at Twitter really knocks us off course, and it takes many minutes to sort of return to that same state of immersion that we were in before we got distracted. And unfortunately, these machines that we use to do our deep work are also the machines that have endless distractions at the ready at all times. And it's just too much to expect of ourselves to be resisting those distractions all the time. And again, we don't have the self-awareness that would allow us to see how much those distractions are really impeding us and impairing us. So we really need to put structures in place that prevent us, that save us from ourselves in a way. I'm a big fan of the kinds of programs like Freedom is one, these platforms that kind of lock us out of all potential distractions so that we can work. We actually, in a sense, we can't rely on the brain to do its own policing of distractions, because it's really, again, to go back to your evolutionary theme, we evolved to be distracted because anything that comes up in our environment could be a potential threat or it could be a potential opportunity. So it really benefited us to be paying attention to whatever was going on. But now that we are expecting ourselves to do this deep, focused, intense work, that's a real disadvantage. So we need to sort of first understand the nature of the evolved brain, and then help it, give it give it the structure and the protections it needs and that it can't really provide on its own.
Yeah, that's amazing. And right now, when you mentioned our evolutionary code, it makes me think, that our technologies have evolved exponentially, and we're still catching up in a sense. Like we still are grasping with the fact that we have instantaneous information everywhere, feedback pretty much at the moment, in the second. So it's this dissonance between being able to access everything and our evolutionary code driving us to want to access everything in terms of
Mm-hmm.
survival, because it's a
Mm-hmm.
tool for survival.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love to this idea of how can we price in our evolutionary code into today's world and into the
Mm-hmm.
future. How do you think we can truly, empower ourselves with the past that we have?
Mm. Yeah, I think it's really important for us to understand, as I was saying before, the nature of the brain. And I think in some ways we're misled by some of what we hear from popular science books and TV shows and videos when we're told all the time that the human brain is so amazing, it's so extraordinary, it's the most complex object in the universe, things like that. We hear that all the time. And yet we hear that, and yet we know that our own brains let us down a lot. We forget things, or we get distracted, or we can't figure things out as quickly or as easily as we would like. And so I think the reason for that disjunction there is that the brain is amazing. The brain is an incredible achievement of evolution, but it did evolve to do jobs that are very different from the jobs that we expect it to do today. And so the way we transcend the limits of the brain is not by working the brain ever harder, but by bringing in resources from the outside. And that could mean the outside of the brain, meaning our bodies, or physical space, resources from physical space, or resources from other people. And these outside the brain resources will allow the brain to, in a sense, overachieve, to do more than it could do on its own. So we need to think of the brain not so much as this workhorse that we just keep flogging to, work harder and harder, which is how a lot of us were learned in school and have applied to our work. Like, this is how you get stuff done. Instead, we want to think of the brain as more like an orchestra conductor that's bringing up this section and then that section, and sort of the brain is still at the center of the action, but it's more coordinating skillfully these external resources rather than trying to do it all on its own.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it seems that the future of how the mind will work is really preparing us into, working the mind, the brain, as you say, like this machine. And
Mm-hmm.
as I don't know if you're really familiar with all of the developments that's happening in Web 3.0 and artificial intelligence, and
Hmm.
just like the movie Ready Player One, right? We just plug in
Hmm.
some VR goggles
Hmm.
and we
Hmm.
plug them
Hmm.
into the internet. Is there a risk that we're not seeing here in terms of, health, with our
Hmm.
bodies being smart and, needing the warmth from people? Do you think that we're
Hmm.
prepared to live in the web 3.0?
To live in the metaverse.
Right.
I think there are dangers there, as you suggest, and I think there's amazing opportunities as well. The dangers would come from forgetting or overlooking, even more than we do already, that we are embodied creatures, that we're embedded in physical surroundings, real, three-dimensional physical surroundings, and tactile physical surroundings, and that we are fundamentally social creatures who really evolved to interact face to face in person with other people. So if we forget about all that and think that we can live fulfilling or rewarding lives in some kind of, digital realm, I think that would be a terrible mistake. On the other hand, where I see the opportunities offered by virtual reality, for example, is that um, take, for example, the fact that we were just discussing earlier, that we're very affected by our environments, and whether we feel like we look around, we judge from what we see around us whether we belong or not. And that includes something like, a female student going into a science class and seeing that she's the only female student in a class full of male students. She may feel that she doesn't belong there, that people like her don't belong. Well, what if in virtual reality you could create a virtual classroom in which all of your classmates and the teacher were all female? Like you can kind of create a reality, because a physical reality, a social reality that doesn't yet exist in our world. And because our thinking is so influenced by the external realities that we encounter, when we can imagine and put into effect in virtual reality these other kinds of universes that we haven't yet been able to create here on Earth, or in our real world environment, that to me is a very exciting application for what we might do with Web 3.0.
Yeah, I've never thought about that. So thank you. It was really interesting to, as we were discussing, our mind truly is a feedback loop between the environment, our
Mm-hmm.
society, and if our society isn't placed in the best way that we wished it would, for example, more representation in STEM for women, we
Mm-hmm.
can we can use our technologies to create that universe. So our minds truly engage in that way with the world.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really interesting. And switching up gears a little bit, I would like to get into quick takes into
Mm-hmm.
your research in the extended mind. So brief questions. So, well, I hope they're brief questions. But if not, go ahead and just expand however you
Mm-hmm.
much.
Mm-hmm.
What is the truest idea you have found regarding
Mm.
our mind?
Oh, wow. Well, there's a phrase that I love from Andy Clark and David Chalmers, and I should mention that those are the two philosophers who came up with the idea of the extended mind. I borrowed their idea for the book. Um, they they say that once we kind of accept and embrace the idea of the extended mind, that we will see that we are truly creatures of the world. And that I love that phrase because it captures something about the really deep implications of the extended mind. It's not just about little tweaks to help you think better. It's really about a fundamental change in how we see ourselves. Are we isolated, individual, sealed off and separate kind of entities, or are we really part and parcel of the world? Are we made of the world and it is made of us? And there's not really this firm boundary between the world and ourselves, or other people and ourselves, that our culture tells us that that boundary is there, but that boundary, the extended mind is really arguing that that boundary is illusory. And if we look more carefully and clearly at how our minds really work, we can see that we are creatures of the world. So to me, that's the truest idea to emerge out of this work.
Yeah, absolutely. And to echo your idea, I remember reading their paper, The Extended Mind, that one of their questions was, where does the mind stop and the rest of the world begins? So
Yes,
that was the
yes.
question that really truly shows what you were saying. Another question that I had is, when is intuition good for us and when is it bad for us?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's certainly true that our intuition doesn't always lead us in the correct direction. We can be misled by our bodily cues. And so that's one reason that I advise in the chapter on interoception, this, as I say, this capacity to attune ourselves to our internal signals and cues, to keep what is called an interoceptive journal, which involves whenever you're making a decision, or deciding between two alternatives, pay attention to what you're feeling and note that down along with what the decision is that you're trying to make. And then return to that later after you've made the decision, after you've seen how everything played out. And then you can check and see, did your bodily sensations lead you astray, or do they point you in the right direction? And this is something that people can use when they're making investment decisions, for example, because people who work in finance will often tell you that although that field is thought to be the province of like the big brains who can crunch lots of information and numbers, actually some of the most successful investors and people in finance really do operate on their gut feelings, because they've learned that their gut feelings are much quicker and often more accurate. So in an environment where they have to make fast decisions that the conscious mind can't really handle, they learn to tune into and to rely on what their bodies are telling them. But it helps to have this record of when and where and under what conditions the body is steering you right, and under what conditions perhaps the body is leading you astray. It can do that. For example, when people suffer from panic attacks, that's actually emerging out of the fact that they're paying too close attention to their body's signals. They're blowing them out of proportion, and in that case, you need to actually kind of learn to separate the body's sensations, what it's telling you, from your perception of reality. So it's not as simple as that your body will always steer you in the right direction. It's a capacity that we need to learn how to use and become skillful about using, just like anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, as you were mentioning, the heightened interception,
Mm-hmm.
and how, the stock market and heartbeats truly
Mm-hmm.
is an
Mm-hmm.
amazing relationship to have.
Mm-hmm.
And keeping a journal is an amazing tool that I've been
Mm-hmm.
using, but I also use keeping a journal for my dreams. Do you think that has an
Mm-hmm.
impact in our
Mm-hmm.
mind?
Mm-hmm. This is straying beyond what I write about in the extended mind, but I'm very interested in dreams, and Freud called them the royal road to the unconscious, and I have become increasingly impressed with the capacity for dreams to provide you with a very compressed and very vivid image that can encompass so much emotional,
Yeah.
so many feelings, so many thoughts, so many realities that you're experiencing during the day. And in this medium that doesn't use language, you don't usually remember words from dreams. What you remember is an image or a feeling or an experience. And so often that dream image that you take away is just this very compressed, very rich distillation of an experience, of what you're going through or what you're feeling at the moment. And so I really admired the capacity of dreams to do that.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, as you mentioned, dreams do open a realm for our unconscious to show itself and our patterns.
Right.
So I think it's a great connection to extend the mind, interoceptively, but also unconsciously. So I think that's an amazing connection I did thanks to your book.
Mm.
And I had another question, which is trying to play the devil's advocate.
Hmm.
What have been
Hmm.
some of the most controversial things you have said that you have
Hmm.
received some backlash? And
Yes.
why do you think they're important for us to know about?
Yes. Yes. Well, the idea of the extended mind, although it's certainly widely known at this point, when it was first introduced, and I'm talking again about Chalmers and Clark and Chalmers paper, which came out in 1998, it was quite controversial, and it was often not only received with skepticism, but also a kind of derision, like a mocking kind of, this is ridiculous, and the problem that people had with the idea, and some still do have with it now, is that it seems so obvious to people that to some people that the brain and the mind are identical, that the mind ends right here. They like to have that very neat boundary between the mind, and which they consider to be sealed inside the skull, and the rest of the world. So that's variations on that critique are what I run into most frequently. In particular, I've run into some backlash from teachers and others in the education world who say, look, we're just starting to get some traction with the science of learning, with helping people understand the cognitive processes that are involved with learning. Don't distract us with the stuff about the body and physical surroundings and social interaction. Like learning is about the mind, and that means it's about the brain, kind of. And I appreciate that that's their point of view, but I think it's just in the end foolish to think that we can cut off the mind from the body, from the spaces we inhabit, from our relationships. It's just heading down a wrong road. And so, but that's my view, and that's their view, and of course, that's the beauty of the marketplace of ideas, right? We'll see whose ideas turn out to weather the test of time.
Yeah, and this has been an amazing conversation. There are so many questions that I still would like to run through you. Hopefully we have another session for us to go through them. But closing out, Annie, what is the deepest question, or what are some of the deepest questions that aren't resolved on the field of cognitive science that ignite your heart?
Oh gosh. That's quite a question, Alex. The questions that interest me have to do with how we can bring our whole selves to our work and our learning and our everyday lives. I think there's the kind of distinctions and separations and cutoffs that the extended mind is pushing back against and saying, no, we actually are creatures of the world. We're embodied creatures. We're embedded in physical spaces. We're parts of social networks. I think we need more of that kind of thinking and less of the kind of thinking that divides everything up very neatly and says this is separate from that. I'm most drawn to philosophies and modes of thinking that look at the connections between things. And so I would love to see even more attention being paid to how our emotions affect the way we think, for example, or how our sense of safety and belonging in a space affects how we think, or how our comfort with our bodies and our sense that we can move and gesture without being self-conscious, how that affects the way that we think. So I hope that answers your question. I'd love to see more of a science of connection and less of us. And although a science of distinctions and separations has in some ways helped us understand our world in lots of useful ways, I think it's time now to sort of start putting the pieces back together.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that idea. And we've gone to this side of the equation where everything is isolated in terms of how we think and how we interact with the world. But we're receiving feedback from our own bodies, how many people are handling stressful situations in terms of bodily mind connection, the need for mindfulness meditation, that growing demand, because that's like a huge feedback of our body just needing the connection. But there are ways we don't need to meditate for 30 minutes to connect. We can just have like you say, like this map of waking up and just doing a bodily scan for 5 minutes. And that triggers you. That triggers you to be into with your body. But I love the idea of connecting us with ourselves, paradoxically, and as funny as that sounds, and with the world and with other people. So, Annie, as you see the extended mind in your work, all your work really does ignite my own heart, and I see why your work is a real treasure for many people. So thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for those kind words, Alex. It's really wonderful to hear as an author, and thanks for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Me too. Take care.